Thank you. So thank you for the invitation and thank you for the introduction, Loretta. I never would have dreamed of placing Hans Arp and Jenny Holzer in one lecture, in one paper, and I'm very happy to do it today, and I'm looking forward to listening to your remarks on that. Arp was a co-founder of Dada Zurich and temporarily joined the Parisian Surrealists. Later, he and his wife, Sophie Teuber-Arp, were active in associations Cercle et Carré, square and circle, and Abstraction Création, abstraction creation, both of which were convinced of the power of the collective. We are currently dedicating an exhibition on this last international association before the Second World War at the Art Museum in Rolandseck. In addition to Jean Arp and Sophie Teuber, Alexander Calder, Barbara Hepworth, Piet Mondrian, and Marlo Moss, around 90 other members belonged to this group, which came together one last time in Paris in the 1930s in the face of militarization and war. Abstraction against fascism. In the foreword to their second jointly published journal, which they used as the main organ for their artistic concerns, they wrote, I quote, "No one can determine in advance what art will be like in the near future. Any attempt to limit artistic endeavor according to consideration of race, ideology, or nationality is abhorrent. We place this second issue under the banner of total resistance to all oppression, whatever form it may take." End of quote. The quote, originating in 1933, the year Hitler took over power in Germany, makes it clear that Arp, who had already positioned himself as a truly convinced objector and opponent of war during the First World War and risked his life for this stance, was working with his artist friends on a new concept of art that could withstand the challenges of the time. Despite his clear political stance, Arp sought with all his creative energy an art that could remain free from ideological appropriation or even narrative content. This made him feel all the more challenged by his time to react. In view of the catastrophic state of the world, his stated goal was to overcome the established boundaries between art and everyday life. To this end, he developed a catchy set of tools in the 1910s that he would draw on throughout his life and his art. How does this work? No? Return? No?
These buttons should do it. No. Some way to make it move. Yeah, there's always got to be a technical problem at some point in the conference. I think we've reached that point. What kind of file is it? It's a PDF. It's through it. Oh, sorry, this is the last one. Yeah. No. Yes. And okay, that's what I meant. But now we're not sharing. Let's see if we can get it both to be shared with the Zoom and on screen. And think in the order, the interest of keeping moving, we should let go of the there. I mean, plug that back into it later. Not quite. There we go. Sorry about the confusion.
One of the methods he discovered early on was to consciously incorporate chance as an artistic medium in his creative process. The Surrealists also cultivated chance as a potential gateway to the subconscious in their écriture automatique, automatic writing, or writing and drawing games. Arp described this in relation to Dada. Chance seemed to us to be a magical procedure with which one could overcome the barrier of causality, of conscious expression of will, with which the inner ear and eye were sharpened until new series of thoughts and experiences emerged. For us, chance was the unconscious that Freud had already discovered in 1900. Arp repeatedly sought the laws of chance, deterministic chaos, and described this in his work titles. The slide shows examples of his elementary constellations from the 1910s, as well as a later print work that revisits this method, but does not execute it as a collage. The change of medium is typical of Arp's work and, from today's perspective, visionary. It is this experimental and at the same time very clearly comprehensible pictorial process that art historian Carola Gideon-Welker described early on as his Arpadian, coming from his name, primordial alphabet. In her precise text, The Artist's Close Friend observes that Arp repeatedly rearranges and groups an elementary basic vocabulary, thereby developing his own language. The analogy to language is obvious because Arp writes as a poet and always uses written and performative spoken text as a possible form of artistic expression. Parallel to the constellations, he developed the linguistic principle of what he calls interpolation. The artist described this in relation to his 1917 text, Weltwunder, Wonders of the World. I quote, "I often determined words and sentences in newspapers with my eyes closed, underlining them with a pencil. I called these poems Arpaden. Many years later, in 1945, I further developed this poem through interpolations. Without touching the original word order, I carefully inserted my words and sentences in between. The following text was created from such an interpolation." I quote, "Those who have a tail tie a lantern to it. The mice tie lanterns to their tails. The steam cows tie lanterns to their tails. The saddled hares tie lanterns to their tails. The paddled lions tie lanterns to their tails. The lanterns may only be tied to the tails. The tails are sufficient to tie so many lanterns that the night becomes golden. The tails of the birds are flowers." Using just a few word building blocks, Arp constantly creates new contexts of meaning that circle elliptically like the image of a snake biting its own tail. The result is pictorial chains of words of the fantastical, which, however, when read as a whole, appear nonsensical. After the Second World War, the Zero artist movement formed throughout Europe as a new beginning after National Socialism. The Dutch artist Herman de Vries, trained as a botanist, joined the Nul group, Nul means zero, in the Netherlands. He incorporated Arp's principles into his own work process early on and combined them with scientific questions. In Hermann de Vries' collage from the 1970s, which he calls random objectivations, he creates arbitrary and thus chance-driven image arrangements, which he understands as expandable systems. This systemic thinking, which Arp understands as a cosmic principle, is one of the main theorems of 20th century art, referencing, for example, minimal art and Donald Judd's famous text, Specific Objects. The overcoming of hierarchies, of pictorial genres, means and materials, and finally, the idea of separating the process of image creation from the artistic process is crucial for Hermann de Vries in his works. He shares this approach with Jean Arp. However, unlike Arp, he works exclusively with materials from nature. The collage, An Afternoon Under a Cherry Tree from 1979, captures the fallen red autumn leaves of a cherry tree in the moment and position in which they come to rest. Chance is a merely observed law of nature. In addition, he shows the leaves in a form arranged by human hand, separated according to typology and morphology, following the perspective of his botanical training. The artist himself makes observation and temporality the subject, categories that also have been the subject of much theoretical discussion since the 1960s. In Arp's 1958 text, Betrachten, Observing, he writes, I quote, "Opening your eyes, seeing, looking, observing the world, observe clouds, trees, cities, and buildings, look into the eyes of sculptures, look into the eyes of people, looking has been my greatest pleasure since childhood." The feedback from the Zero artists to Arp is also evident in the history of our railway station and today's museum. In 1966, the Zero artists celebrated a farewell party for the movement in the station building under the motto, "Zero is good for you." The number 0 stamped on the hand served as an admission ticket. The reference to Arp's navel, which he would write throughout his life as the primordial element of his art parts, is abundantly clear. Hermann de Vries' Winter Vegetation, a collection of simple grasses that grow in specific geographical regions in winter, takes up this serial principle of chance, incorporates the slowness of observation, and ultimately arranges according to the laws of nature a thought related to art, but transferred into materiality. Arp's group of works entitled Constellations varies organic, free forms that the artist derives from nature, but for which he formulates the claim to produce as the plant produces its fruit and not to reproduce. Carola Gideon-Welke illustrated this fluid approach in the 1930s in her famous juxtapositions of images. Here, a sculpture from his group of works entitled Concretions with a river frozen over with ice and snow. Arp's declared aim is to transform his works into a fundamental mutability. His variations in form and constellations remain open systems, responding to the world rather with questions than with answers. In 1981, the Swiss artist Kabel Fischli-Weiss created a deliberately overwhelming work whose exuberant theatrical narrative is almost impossible to grasp when viewed. Suddenly, this overview. The counterintuitive title consists of over 350 sculptures made of unfired clay. They show sketchy, stage-like visualizations of great historical moments and reduce them to everyday situations, told in a casual conversational tone. The humor lies in the laconic nature of the momentum that has been exhausted. Mick Jagger and Brian Jones satisfied on the way home after they composed I Can Get No Satisfaction. The young Bob Dylan arriving in New York, Pythagoras admires his theorem with satisfaction. I quote the artists, "It doesn't work. Fischli Weiss remarked on the puzzle in the sculpture Big and Small. Quote going on. A mouse and an elephant stand next to each other, both the same size. Small stands next to the mouse, big next to the elephant. Actually, it should be the other way around, because the mouse is greatly enlarged, isn't it? And the elephant is depicted as very small. Actually, the situation is this. The distinction between large and small take place in the imagination. In the plastic realization of the overview, it is said with benevolent equanimity, the elephant and the mouse are the same size, end of quote. And another quote from Jean Arp's text, Fairy Tale from 1904. My shadow grows bigger and bigger. I myself grow smaller and smaller. Small as a mouse. My shadow grows bigger and bigger. I myself grow smaller and smaller. Small as a dot. Where does this lead? Where does this lead? To the big and small infinity. The play with dimensions, scale, and proportionality is a theme that can be traced throughout Arp's entire oeuvre. This principle is evident in his Arpaden, a portfolio of 7 lithographs published in 1923 in Kurt Schwitter's März series, as his so-called object language. The 7 symbols stand as Dadaist signs, on the one hand like sculptural solitaires on the page, what is black, what is white, what is foreground, what is background, and on the other hand like cosmic forms of a pictorial alphabet. The Schnurrhut, a compound word in German very common, combining Schnurrbart, mustache, and hat, stands next to the C. The navel bottle, the Schnurruhr, a mustache and a clock amalgamated according to the same principle, the egg beater and the Arabic 8. It is a surreal, nonsensical alphabet, yet at the same time it draws on forms whose meaning extends far beyond Arp's work. I have already referred to the navel and its relationship to zero. We have dedicated an entire exhibition in Berlin to the navel in 2016, ranging from its prehistorical significance to Ellsworth Kelly's sculpture White Ring from 1966. Art places these symbols in open rows, creating a fluid cosmos that is self-referential on the one hand, while on the other hand addressing universal answers in a pictorial language. Fischli Weiss also posed such questions in their popular work, Will Happiness Find Me? From 2003, which itself is based on a text from 1981. In an overwhelming room installation, they projected seemingly universal questions that are at the same time absurd in their statement. Should I show more interest in the world? Should I put my everlasting efforts appear normal to better use? Am I leading a modern life? Is my stupidity a warm coat? The questions, published in a widely distributed artist's book, form a wild mix of existential, absurd, and humorous approaches to a multi-layered perception of happiness. Cultural patterns and explanatory models from the history of philosophy are jumbled together in a process that breaks down boundaries, positioning themselves between meaningfulness and deconstructive refusal. Unlike in the work Suddenly This Overview I've shown you before, the two artists here construct their artistic alphabet solely from questions that evoke images rather than scenes. The fleetingness and dynamism of the text becomes an analogy for happiness. The text does not seek to be normative or deliberately directed. In this respect, it resembles Arp's instrumentarium, which here, however, in the spirit of postmodernism, breaks free even more and unbound from any underlying concept of truth. The text logically ends with a helpless question that simultaneously carries within the impossibility of answering it, and thus also a nihilistic dimension. Is happiness looking for me in the wrong place? This fine network of associations in Fischli Weiss' work corresponds in many ways to the Dadaist and Surrealist beginnings in Arp's writing. At the same time, humor and its absurd transfer to everyday life, the deliberate reduction of big themes and questions, is an artistic method that Arp uses in his work. Works of art, Arbrights must remain anonymous in the great workshop of nature, like the clouds, the mountains, the seas, the animals, and the people. The anonymity of origin and the deliberate separation of the production process from the conceptual process are essential anchors for classifying Arp's approaches and understanding the revolutionary nature of his concept of art, which is fully focused on the collective. Similarly and Weiss, the American conceptual artist Jenny Holzer also approaches the world through language. In her first text series, Truisms, which was written in the late 1970s, at the end of her studies, she deals with concepts and constructions of truth, citing the history of Western thought as well as everyday quotes and sayings. Abuse of power comes as no surprise. Raise boys and girls the same way. Money creates taste. Truth is approximated as absolute, yet at the same time it appears fragmented. The text series is a loose sequence of around 300 single lines. At the same time of its creation, the artist had them distributed on flyers, posted on building walls, and printed on t-shirts, baseball caps, and condoms. In the 1980s, she joined the activist New York artist group Collab and used the prominent billboard in Times Square for the first time. Since then, she has worked extensively in public and museum spaces with projection and laser technology, but above all with programmed LED strips commonly used in advertising. There, her messages flash up like fleeting stimuli. Taken together, they form a cartography that, according to the artist herself, she has created like an alphabet to help her find her way around as a young artist arriving from the Middle West in New York. Arp's friend Tristan Tzara describes in one of his Dadaist texts, take a newspaper, take a pair of scissors, find an article of the length of the poem you want to make, cut it out, then cut out each of its words and put them in a bag, shake it, then take out one piece at a time and write it down. The poem will be like you. Jenny Holzer's texts convey a clear message. They address the state of the world and question the nature of orders and structures, the validity of generally accepted truth. Unlike the Dadaist texts described by Tzara, her works contain a genuine offer of communication that is not based on nonsense, but on a collective social task. This is why she strives to bring her work into the public sphere and thus into people's everyday consciousness. Finally, for me, Simon Fujiwara's Little Who the Bear represents the work of a younger generation of artists who are even more determined to question the constitution of our society. In the style of a children's book, the bear addresses very simple questions about identity and the possibilities of peaceful coexistence in the spirit of a tolerant community. Who the Bear, the art figure that Simon Fujiwara has been continuously developing since 2020, touches on current socio-political questions about our own orientation in the world. The figure appears to have no gender, sexuality, or nationality. At the same time, it unites the contradictions and disunity that accompany us today in the distorted image of a globalized world driven by social media. What is my identity based on? How do I stand in and towards the world? What can art achieve? Christina Feg, director of the Bielefeld Kunsthalle, recently brought Who the Bear together with Arp's sculpture of an old stream. My lecture began with Arp's positioning in a world that forced him to take a stance, even though he was searching for a concept of art that was free from political appropriation. His texts are not mere nonsense verses, and when he writes in his famous Opus Null, that means zero again, I am the great this, that, a they, then for me that is a clear commitment to questioning identity, but above all to remaining curious and approaching the world with the necessary openness. Thank you.
I was thinking of the remark of the gentleman up there. It's not about only what looks similar, but what is similar on a much more subtle level. And it was amazing to see the connection between Holzer, Fujiwara, or also somebody like Herman de Vries. Thank you so much. That was amazing. Thank you. We have another 6 minutes for remark. We're back to time and questions. Does somebody want to join in the discussion? I think everybody's overwhelmed.
It's a very wide span, I know.
Yeah.
But and coming from the early ARB and getting through it, it was quite interesting to look at his texts again.
I mean, you started your conversation or your talk about reminding us into what many artist areas ARP was himself connected into, concretion, abstraction, about the Dadaist movement. And he was a true genius of interconnection, friendship, and also being part of artist group who were very, very different and were normally opposing. And I think now what's so exciting is that we can suddenly span this interconnectivity during his lifetime through this conference now into the ongoing decades, where you also suddenly have an artist like Finlay or Jenny Holzer or others, where you would have never have the idea there's a connection. And ARP, for me, the whole cosmos of the interconnectivity of ARP is truly opening up this morning. And I'm really thankful for all of your contributions.
Thank you very much for this fascinating presentation. And that I have a question about Jenny Holzer and our Holzer's work, particularly in the 80s, has a very political agenda. She's reacting against the presidency of Ronald Reagan and the seemingly unconstrained embrace of capitalism, of a kind of right-wing ideology, which of course seems very relevant today. And although her truisms seem a little nonsensical, they're very pointed in a political way. Do you see any kind of similarly focused political agenda in ARP's writings?
That was why I read out at the beginning the quotation from Abstraction Création in the 1930s, because I mean he somehow felt forced into into being anti something. He was never anti anything. He once said in an interview he never was enemy to anything, because he was such a soft figure and he was such a soft man, really uncommon for his time. And I mean he rejected to take part in World War I, and this was, as we know, a real act, an act of was dangerous at the time, so he himself saw himself forced to be on a political side, but he never wanted to be, but he never had the chance to be not political. And I think, and I'm really convinced that sentences like "I'm the great this that they mean something, and they are not pure nonsense. But there is a statement, and from my point of view, a very clear statement. If you say something like that in 1924, this is a very clear statement.
Okay.
Which in the title, the form is very ARPish, but there are collage materials in newspaper over the form which reference the Spanish Civil War. So both the title and the collage text seem to me very political at that moment. I don't know how typical that is, but that comes to mind. And if I may, my question is that since you worked so much on Jenny Holzer with your dissertation, whether you ever spoke to her directly or had any kind of dialogue as
yes, I did.
About
ARP.
ARP.
It was long before, obviously long. It was in the 1990s and long before my my occupation with art, but I was talking with her about the surrealist and écriture automatique, but she was very, very rigid about her sources, and she always has been rigid about her sources in the truisms, as claiming them as anonymous and just overall knowledge coming from everywhere and nowhere. And this is something similar that art does all the time, that there's the anonymity of nature, and the anonymity of things is a very specific topic for him. So I found that in a parallel, but she never openly speaks about her sources. But I'm very sure that she knew the Dada movement very well.